But Solomon was one that, as king over the nation of Israel, thanks, Amy, over the nation of Israel, he created a mammoth bureaucracy and a huge building program. He used slave labor from his own people to fulfill all of the projects that he had. He had all kinds of goods coming in and going out, and he had a great table of elites in his nation that he would feed every day from all the food and all the money that would come in. Of course, they would need the money, but they used the money, of course, to maintain this great banquet hall and feasting for all of these important people in the nation of Israel. So we talked last week also Saul's failure. We talked a little bit about what eventually brought down Solomon's fall, but like I said, we'll get to that in First Kings. But Saul becomes king, and at first he looks really good in chapters 9 through 12. But then he's sacrificed at Gilgal in chapter 13, which God had told him to wait till Samuel gets there. Chapter 15, he spared the Amalekites. He was supposed to destroy them, but he didn't kill them all. And anyway, David then is chosen as king. God says, I'm going to replace you with a man after my own heart. And of course, that's where David gets that title. You know, David was a man after God's own heart. What do you think God meant by that? What does it mean to say that David is a man after God's own heart? Okay, he wants for his own life. He wants for Israel. He wants the things in life in accordance with the kinds of things that God would want. And that means then, and related to that, this is the kind of person that I approve of. This is the kind of person that I can look at and say, I approve this person. This is a person who I elevate and exalt. So he does whatever I want, and therefore my heart is also with him. My desires are with him. Now, obviously, we all know the story of David. We're going to get to that in particular in the book of Second Samuel. But we're going to see that when David, though he was a man after God's own heart, he was obviously he was very human. Okay. And we'll talk a little bit more, perhaps David personality-wise here as we continue on. But David's a very interesting figure. He was, in a sense, maybe not as much as Solomon, but he was something of a Renaissance man because he was so multi-talented in different things. And I think that he even had apparently some building expertise and architectural expertise. He was going to build the temple, and God told him not to. So if you look at David's life, you can see that he was a musician, a poet, a theologian, perhaps had some expertise in building projects, and a great soldier and a great leader. So anyway, he was something of a Renaissance man, perhaps, like I said, not to the extent that his son Solomon was, but certainly he is a cut above in terms of capability over just about everybody else that you can mention in the scriptures. Anyway, Israel demands a king. They get Saul. Saul fails. David then is chosen, and Saul is rejected. So if you turn to chapter 16 just very quickly, Samuel goes to Bethlehem, and he begins, God says, I want you to go to Bethlehem, go to the house of Jesse, and I want you to find this new king. Okay. So Saul starts lining them up. Takes the oldest one first. This has got to be him. Look at this guy. Here's a man's man. And I don't want him, God says. Well, how about the next one? Don't want him either. He goes through them all, and he finally gets down to the end. Do you have any more sons, Jesse? Well, I got one. He's a shepherd boy. He's out taking care of the sheep. We'll bring him in here. And God says, this is the one. Anoint him. And he becomes a king. Of course, he has not yet taken the throne, but he's certainly been anointed. And he, in a sense, God has now ordained that there's going to be a change at the helm. And the rest of the book of 1 Samuel tells us how that takes place. And you all know the story of David and Saul, I'm sure, and the difficulties and trials that David went through in order to finally reach the throne. But anyway, David is chosen, Saul is rejected. And then we find that David shows his expertise and his courage very early on. Nobody knows how exactly old he was in chapter 17, but he faces Goliath. He's probably a teenager. That would be a good conjecture. He's the youngest of 8 sons. I figure he's probably somewhere in his teenage years. We don't know. Nobody does, but that's kind of what the consensus is. So let's just say David was 17 years old. He comes to the camp. He brings provisions for his brothers, and then his brother says to him, well, I know you're just down here to see the battle. You're just being ornery. And David says, that's not why I'm here. I brought you all this stuff to eat. He looks out, he sees Goliath come out. And Goliath of Gath, he has a spear that's like a weaver's beam. And I looked it up one time. I think his sword or the head of his spear was 600 shekels of iron, we're told in chapter 16, verse 7, which I did some figuring one time, and I found that was about 17 pounds. Now imagine having a big stick with a 16-pound bowling ball on the end of it and carrying that around and able to throw it. So this is a large man. This is a big, strong, husky fellow that nobody wants to face him. He comes out every day and he defies Israel. He defies God and says, send somebody out here and I'll tear him limb from limb. David hears this. I'm not taking this. This is my paraphrase, okay? God doesn't have to take this either. I'm not listening to this any longer. So he goes out and he says, hey, look, I can take care of this guy. Well, you're just a kid. Well, when I was watching my dad's sheep, a bear came in one time and I killed the bear. And he was trying to take all the sheep, and I killed the bear. And a lion came in, tried to take away some of the sheep and kill them. So I killed the lion too. And the same God who delivered the bear and the lion into my hand will deliver this Philistine into my hand. So, of course, we know what happens. Goliath comes out one more time, and David says, that's enough. And he goes out, he gets 5 stones, and he goes out with his sling. And we see in this story, after David goes out to meet him, he says, the Philistine rose, this is verse 48 of chapter 17, and came and draw near to David. We got to read David's words. These are, we ought to keep this in mind whenever we come up against a struggle or a trial. Then the Philistine, this is verse 41, then the Philistine came on and approached David with a shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy with a handsome appearance. So he's just a good-looking kid, right? But he's a no account as far as Goliath is concerned. The Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine also said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. Famous last words. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you, and I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Now, that's pretty big talk, but David's able to back it up. It's big talk, but you know what? He's not talking about how wonderful he is. David's strength is in God. And so he's not just talking here. He's put his faith in Yahweh. And this is how we win. This is who our protector is. This is who our king is. This is who our leader is. And so oftentimes, friends, I think we get disconcerted in our efforts because we forget who's on our side. we forget for whom we are fighting. And I don't mean that we should go out of here and start hitting people in the head with rocks and stuff like that, to show how great God is. I don't mean that at all. But the point is, it's not necessarily through violence. The point is, we have God on our side. And as we see our world seemingly becoming more and more godless, less and less godly, we tend to get upset. We tend to worry. We tend to fret. The reality is, though, friends, God has got everything under control. He's on our side. And even if in the world's estimation we lose, we win. Because there's more to the show than what we see in front of us. And there's more to the show than this life. So David goes out, puts his hand in the bag, takes a stone, he slings it, hits Goliath right between the eyes. And then he cuts his head off with his own sword. So the Philistines see this and they run, and they're routed by the Israelites. So Saul says, hey, this guy, I want him near me. So he takes David and makes him part of his entourage, part of his staff, as it were. And Jonathan, Saul's son, and David have a very quick bond. They're like two peas in a pod. They're best of friends. And we see that picking up here in verse 18. And at first, things are going very, very well. But what happens is Saul gets jealous. I want you to notice that wherever Saul sent him, 18:5 says, David would go and prospered, and Saul set him over the men of war, and it was pleasing in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. It happened as they were coming, when David returned from killing the Philistine, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. The women sang as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Then Saul became very angry, for his saying displeased him, and he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, but to me they have ascribed thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom? Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. Anyway, the timeline here is not 100% clear, because at first blush it appears that much time has gone by, or at least a period of time has gone by. But it says that when he comes back from killing the Philistine, probably what happened was they continued the campaign for a period of weeks. And then, of course, news of David and his military prowess comes back. And then when David comes back, they apparently praise David more than they praise Saul. Now, let me ask a question. And obviously the answer to this is no. I'm trying to think of how to phrase the question. I'll give you a hint. Verse 7 is poetry. Okay? So what was Saul's problem then when he heard this chant? Pardon? He's just jealous, but should he have been? Were they really saying that David is 10 times the soldier Saul is? Now remember Hebrew poetry. The first and the second lines oftentimes are synonymous. God is great. He is my stronghold. He is almighty. He is my fortress. You see how those are the two? They're used different words, but it means the same thing. God will send forth his thousands of angels in order to do his will. He will send forth myriads of his servants to bring about his plans. I just made that up. That's nowhere in scripture, though it's biblical. It's not a verse. But did I say anything different the second time than I did the first? I embellished it. Instead of thousands, I said myriads, which is, many, 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 many thousands. So when they said Saul killed his thousands and David his 10,000s, what are they saying? They had a successful campaign. And what they're really saying, if there's a good case can be made that they don't mean anything by this at all that Saul thinks they mean. They're merely speaking in accordance with the poetry of their day. They're simply saying that between Saul and David, they were successful, and they were really successful. They're merely saying the same thing twice, but they just merely, again, it's parallelism. Saul, thousands, David, 10,000s. They could have just as easily have said David, thousands, Saul, 10,000s, but they didn't. But Saul misinterprets this. There's a good case to be made that he's misinterpreting as they don't really mean that David is better than Saul. They're merely using the poetic form of their day to make the case. As Jody said, this was a successful campaign. Our armies were victorious under these two great leaders. Well, Saul gets paranoid. They're only giving to me thousands, David 10,000s. The next thing you know, he's going to be king. Well, he does not know yet, but David is going to be king. He apparently has not yet got the memo. So anyway, David's going to be king. He gets jealous. And of course, I'm not going to go into all the details here, but you find that Saul tries to kill David on a couple different occasions. Jonathan, who is David's best friend, doesn't really believe that this is happening. David says, no, your father's trying to kill me. Okay, here's what we're going to do. And they hatched a plan that David would go out in the field. And when Jonathan got information that was necessary to solidify David's suspicions or not, he would come out and signal to David that he should run. Well, they throw a feast and David's supposed to go, and David doesn't show up. Jonathan doesn't say anything. And Saul says, well, where's David? Well, he had to go on an errand. Well, Saul gets extremely mad. And he then says to Jonathan, don't you realize that he's going to be king one of these days, and you're not going to be king, and everything that I have that's going to be given to you is going to be taken away from you. So Jonathan recognizes that Saul wants to kill David. So he goes back out in the field, he shoots an arrow, and without going into all the details, you can read it there in chapters 18 and 19 and 20. You can read about how Jonathan warns David, and David goes on the lam. He runs away. And twice between chapters 19 and 29, David, as he's running, at least twice, he spares Saul's life. In chapter 24, we read that Saul is chasing after David. And we're told that, I'm trying to find the exact verse here. In chapter 24, verses 1 through 3, Saul returns from pursuing the Philistines. Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. Saul took 3,000 chosen men. They run after David, and we're told he came to the sheepfolds on the way, and there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the inner recesses of the cave. Now, this is getting right down to the nitty-gritty of life. I mean, he's in there using the toilet, is what he's doing. And David's hiding, but he's within arm's reach. Saul doesn't see him. He reaches out. He cuts off the hem of his garment. Saul gets up after he's finished, leaves the cave. He gets a distance away. David comes out and says, I could have killed you, Saul, but I didn't. Here's proof. I cut off the hem of your garment. And Saul's somewhat repentant. I won't bother you anymore. That doesn't happen. He still continues to pursue David. And once again, in chapter 26, he spares Saul again. This time we are told that Saul is sleeping, and all of the men in the camp fall asleep, and God puts a deep sleep upon them. David goes up. He then takes Saul's spear. And it says here in chapter 26, the Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah, saying, is not David hiding in Hachilah, which is before Jeshimon? So Saul goes after him. David's in the wilderness there. And then David sees the camp, and he says to Ahimelech the Hittite and to Abishai the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, saying, who will go down with me to the Saul in the camp? And Abishai said, I will go down with you. So David and Abishai came to the people by night, and behold, Saul lay sleeping inside the circle of the camp with his spear stuck in the ground at the head, and Abner and the people were lying around him. Abner is like his commander-in-chief of his army. Abishai said to David, today God has delivered your enemy into your hand. Now, therefore, please let me strike him with a spear to the ground with one stroke. I will not strike him the second time. David says, no, don't destroy him. So anyway, so David took the spear, verse 12 says, and the jug of water from beside Saul's head. He gets away, he calls out and says, hey, Saul, guess what? I spared your life again. And Saul, again, filled with remorse, says to David, you're more honorable than me. And he promises once again, I'm not going to harass you. So anyway, that's kind of the end of the relationship, I guess you might say, between David and Saul. But David then, as we go on through the remainder of the book, he defeats the remainder of the Amalekites that Saul did not destroy. And then we see the end of Saul in chapter 31, verses 1 through 13. He's killed at the Battle of Gilboa. And the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons. Saul is wounded by an archer. And he tells his armor bearer, run me through and kill me because I don't want the Philistines to kill me. And the guy can't do it. And anyway, the armor bearer takes his sword. Saul takes his sword and falls on it. And then the armor bearer, he also falls on the sword and kills himself. And then, of course, Saul dies with his 3 sons. His armor bearer, Jonathan, is killed, David's best friend. And that's how the book of 1 Samuel ends, with the death of Saul, stripped of his weapons, as you can read at the end of the chapter. And their bones are retrieved at the very end of the book, and they're buried in a better place than in Philistia or Gilboa. Any questions or comments over anything? Again, just giving you the bare bones of this, not going into a lot of detail. But it shows you the progression of the nation of Israel from the end of the time of the judges until the death of the first king, Saul. So you start out with Eli, who is the high priest and judge at the time. Hannah has Samuel. Samuel becomes judge. Saul becomes king. Saul is jealous of David, who rises to the top. Saul is killed in battle, and now David's going to become king in second Samuel. Any questions or comments over anything? Any observations that perhaps you made that you're interested in or thought about?
When you were saying about Saul and his jealousy, I think a lot of that depends on this particular makeup of the particular person.
Right.
So when he heard that, he didn't fight.
Right. And he was probably a particularly vain man. And because a good leader doesn't necessarily care if he gets the credit or not, as long as it gets done. And, nobody's going to say that obviously Dwight Eisenhower was more important than FDR. I mean, clearly those kinds of things, the relationship between the commander-in-chief and the commanders on the battlefield. Of course, Eisenhower wasn't on the battlefield. He was a Supreme Allied commander. But obviously, that's really a reflection on FDR's, perhaps, wisdom. And the wisdom of the Department of War, which was not called the Department of Defense at the time. It was still called the Department of War. So the War Department, they're the ones who put these people into positions of authority. And so nobody's going to say that, well, there would be no reason for FDR to be jealous of Eisenhower or of John Marshall. Was John Marshall the chief of, was that who it was? The general who he stayed in Washington. He wanted to be on the battlefield, but FDR wouldn't let him. I think it was Marshall. I can't think of his first name. So anyway, nobody's going to say that these guys were not important or that somehow Eisenhower stole their thunder. That's not what happened. A good leader will put the best people in the position that he can, and it's a credit to his wisdom, not something that should create hard feelings. Anything else? Well, if not, let's start 2 Samuel then. Oh, we haven't finished yet, have we? Key chapter 8 is where Saul is instilled as king. The key verses, perhaps of these key verses, 15, 22, and 23 are prime. Has the Lord his great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord. That's where Saul made his excuse. I didn't kill all the Amalekites and the animals, we saved them because we wanted the sacrifice. God doesn't care about sacrifices as much as he cares about obedience. And that's something that we need to remember as well. And we talked about that a little bit last week. Keep in mind that God, that really is a theme that you find throughout scriptures. Remember the passage there in Micah chapter 6. What will I bring for my sin? Will I bring rivers of oil? Will I bring sacrifices? Will I bring all of these things to atone for my sin? No, what does the Lord require of you but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? We see the same thing in the book of Hosea, by the way. Hosea chapter 6, verse 6. Somebody want to look that up? Somebody read Hosea chapter 6, verse 6. Anyways, good and loud. Hosea 6:6. Anybody have it?
For I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offering.
Right. We got the same thing there. Same thing, Psalm 51. You do not require, David is repenting of his sin with Bathsheba. He says, you don't require, I'd bring sacrifices if that's what you wanted, but what you want is a humble and contrite heart. Because ultimately, the sacrifice is just a ritual. If your heart's not in it, the ritual is meaningless. What really counts is the heart attitude. So we find that throughout Scripture. That's all over the place. Jesus himself said, if you knew the meaning of the Scripture, I would have mercy and not sacrifice. You wouldn't condemn the innocent. So you find that in Jesus's ministry as well. You find it all throughout the Old and New Testaments. Chapter 16, verse 7 of the book of 1 Samuel also, I think, is a crucial key verse here. Do not look at his appearance, the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as a man sees, for a man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. We tend to look at what a person looks like on the outside, and we judge them accordingly. God looks what's on the inside. Chapter 2, verse 30. Therefore, the Lord God of Israel declares, I did indeed say that your house and the house of your father should walk before me forever. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me. For those who honor me, I will honor, and those who despise me will be lightly esteemed. Those are the words God is rebuking Eli. If you honor God, he'll honor you. And then chapter 8, verse 7. Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they may say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. So that's a crucial turning point in the book of 1 Samuel. So I think those are the highlight verses. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff. The book of 1 Samuel as 2 Samuel are extremely fun to read because of all the battles and the intrigue and the court upheavals and all of the things that go on. It's just, it would be a great movie if somebody could do a good job of the life of David, for example, or the books of 1 and 2 Samuel. Probably won't happen in my lifetime, but it would be a great thing to see. Key chapter 8, Saul installed as king. Eli, Samuel, Saul, David, and Jonathan are the key figures. Message, failed leadership, Eli, Hophni, Phinehas, and Saul. The search for competent leadership, Samuel and David. It's also a message of jealousy. It's a message of friendship. We could also say, and I didn't put this in there, but you could add this. It's a picture of God in his providence, bringing about his plans and purposes. His will cannot be thwarted. David said, or God said to David, you will be king. Now, let me ask a question, though. It's interesting. God said, David, you will be king. And there's no going back. It's clearly going to happen because I'm in control of all things. Was it good then that David ran away? Was it good that he hid himself? Should he just stood up and said, hey, you can't do anything to me? Saul, I'm going to be king, and there's nothing you can do about it, so go ahead and throw your spear. Should David have done that?
And that's what God wanted him to do.
Okay, that's the means by which God preserved David's life. We can look at, it's easy to look at David and say, oh yeah, sure, God said I'm going to be king, therefore I have nothing to fear. By the same token, the scriptures often tell us that we are to use wisdom in pursuing the means by which we accomplish God's goals. And God accomplishes his goals oftentimes through the ordinary things of life. I'm trying to think of a good example practically off the top of my head, but God promises, okay, he promises that he's going to provide for us, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't work so that we can make money to buy food to eat and have a house over our heads. It's foolhardy to tempt fate. Or since God's going to protect me, again, what did Satan say to Jesus? If you're the Christ, if you're the Son of God, then go ahead and throw yourself down from this precipice, because nothing's going to happen to you. And Jesus, to paraphrase, says, I'm not going to be foolhardy. I'm not going to put God to the test. I'm not going to go contrary to common sense, because those are the means by which God often works and usually works. He doesn't usually give manna from heaven. Usually he provides through work and the grocery store.
So David did some stuff in this book that was like a little, I don't know, you have to think about it a little bit. Like he was staying with that one king and he went out every day praying.
Yeah.
That he was attacking like a certain group of people, but exactly. Like he did some things that were very
Dubious in terms of their ethical responsibility.
I don't know, questionable or like not manipulative, like strategic.
Yeah.
Strategic things. So I'm thinking about it. I was reading this week and I'm still thinking through that. But I also noticed at the end when God needed him, when it wouldn't have been good for him to go, he didn't want to be part of killing Saul.
Right.
God orchestrated it so that he was somewhere else far away from that
Right.
battle. Like little frustrated. I was struggling a little with this book, but then when I was reading, I realized like if you're doing your best to try to do God's will, it's a bit of a journey. Like some days you get it right, and some days you're trusting in your own strategy
Right.
to the point that maybe you might have erred one way or the other, but in the end, God also can provide and protect and lead you.
Right.
I don't know. I thought it was. I'm still working through it.
Well, I think your point's an interesting one, and I think it's worthy of discussion. Because I never really thought of all the stuff when he he fights against all these other enemies, but he lies to the Philistines and says, I'm actually raiding the Israelites. But by the same token, look at it this way. He is lying to the enemy of his people. That is the kind of intrigue that happens all the time in warfare.
And in life,
And
like, even in life, like if you're thinking about getting a different job, but you're doing good for your boss, but you're not telling your boss, I'm not gonna be there in 6 months, because it's just the way it works out.
Right.
Like, I don't know.
Well, and given that illustration, though, let's say I start looking for another job. I was working for Custom Truck One Source in Elkhart, Indiana. Let's say I wanted to go look for another job. I wouldn't necessarily tell my employer I was doing that, because if that falls through, he might fire me.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's no reason for me to, I'm trying to think of the phrase. I'm not being, with that.
You don't.
Yeah.
It's not dishonest, but it's also kind of.
Well, again, you don't want to count your chickens before they're hatched, which of course is not in the Bible. There is places where that kind of a theme is mentioned. Let not him who puts on his armor boast like he who takes it off. That's the same way of saying that, don't count your chickens before they're hatched. But yeah, you don't want to. In your workplace illustration, I never thought of that before. You're hiding something from your boss, but yeah, I would consider that dishonest.
No, it's just, I just felt like.
It's strategic, like you
It's
said.
full about, like, real life, like, it's not just ancient, like, this ancient story,
Oh,
but it's
yeah.
like, I don't know, it made me feel hopeful about real life. But the other thing I thought was interesting is a lot of things about David reminded me, because we just studied Islam for school. A lot of the stuff he did reminded me a lot of what Muhammad did with, and how I was 100 and like, sometimes you gotta wonder, like, what made the difference because there was a lot of things that were similar.
Well, they're ancient years and civilizations,
Yeah, it
which
was
had
interesting.
and Semitic peoples would have the same kind of. Remember was it the first Gulf War, second Gulf War, when they pulled that statue down of and they hit him with the shoe. Okay, I think I mentioned that here several weeks ago. That kind of reminds you that evidently taking your shoe off and is either an expression of, or it is a admission of humiliation, guilt, and being a jerk. So when they took their shoe off and hit him in the face, that statue, that was their way of showing contempt for him. So they're still doing those kinds of things today. Yeah, which is a way of humiliation. Right. So, yeah, the ancient Near Eastern world is to a great degree a mystery to us. Now, there's a lot of good stuff out there if you want to read that'll give you a lot of insight into what was going on in this world. But yeah, there's a lot of things that you look at and you say, oh yeah, I see a parallel today, because the culture in many ways still hangs on to vestiges of their, and we do too. We just don't see it because we're so used to it. How much law in the United States goes back to English common law from the Middle Ages? We don't see the similarities between us and Northern European culture, or the similarities between us and English culture. But we do a lot of things. To this day, in the Bible, for example, a gray hair means wisdom. That's why those judges wear those gray curly wigs in England. The guy could be as bald as I am, but he comes out there and he has a gray curly wig on. Why is that? Because that symbolizes wisdom. So that's not necessarily a connection between us and England, but it's a connection between England and perhaps the Bible, where the gray hedge is a reflection of a person's ability and wisdom. So anyway, yeah, cultures oftentimes carry over for centuries and centuries and centuries. The things we say, the mannerisms we have. Why do we shake with the right hand? Pardon? Well, in Islam, you don't shake with your left hand. That's an insult, because that's the hand that they use in the bathroom. Okay? But we shake with the right hand because most people are right-handed. And you draw your sword with your right hand. If you extend your empty right hand, then that's showing goodwill. Now, that's why I was just reading it this morning in the book of 2 Samuel. There's one particular place where, is it Joab? Oh, let's go back to Eglon. Remember when Ehud killed Eglon in the book of Judges? He's left-handed. So when he reaches out to Eglon and kisses him, he takes hold of his beard and kisses him on the cheek, takes out his sword with his left hand and kills him. And that we don't understand what's the significance of that unless you understand that the right hand being extended would have been an act of peace, but it was an act of treachery. Well, in a sense, it wasn't treachery because Ehud was a judge and he killed Eglon, who was a wicked ruler, a foreign ruler, and he was delivering the nation of Israel from whoever it was, the Amalekites or Midianites or whoever it was. So, yeah, these cultural things, and it is sometimes difficult in our culture. What do we do when it comes to, like David, doing some of this backstabbing type of stuff that he was doing with the Philistines? Remember, his ultimate enemy is the Philistines. People use espionage and dishonesty in warfare all the time. Is it wrong to do that? Well, no. As a matter of fact, we were talking last week, is it ever okay to lie? Well, we lie all the time and we accept it. For example, you ever see a play action pass in a football game? That's an act of deception. Nobody cares because it's part of the game. It's understood. Nobody says, well, that's a lie. You can't throw, you're right, I guess no, it's within the realm and the capacity of the game. And the same is true in warfare. It's, in a sense, it's a lie, obviously, to put fake papers on a dead body, throw it off of a submarine so the Germans find it, hoping that they are going to expect a different battle plan than what we really have in store. Is that a lie? Or certainly. Is it wrong? No. Because that's part of, in a sense, the game. I mean, we could debate that. I don't mean me, but I mean people in general. We could debate that, whether or not that's dishonest and we should do that. I would argue no, that's perfectly acceptable. Just like the play action pass. What other kinds of deceptions are used in a football game? All kinds of stuff, I'm sure. Fake, yeah, well, that's like a play action pass, or there's always trickery used in things. Yeah, go ahead, Myron.
Even Hollywood's that way. I mean, you have an actor who's playing, Taylor, but he's not really Obi his whole life. He is some person his own way. That's
yeah. If somebody tells a lie in a book, it's a novel, and somebody tells a lie. Well, we don't look at that and say, well, that guy shouldn't put that in the book. Obviously, we realize that in the character, that was an evil thing for him to do. But we don't say, well, lies shouldn't be in books. Because sometimes they are. Oftentimes we hear people complain, well, look at all the lies and the deception that are in the Bible. I don't want anything to do with it. Yeah, but not everything that's in the Bible is there as an example for us to follow. Sometimes the things that we see in the Bible are warnings to not follow. So anyway, good discussion. I mean, there's all kinds of things we could talk about when it comes to these sorts of things. But anyway, we got to call our quits. We'll finish up this next week, and then we'll finish 2 Samuel, or we'll start 2 Samuel the next week.